Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here to give you my review of the Meike 50mm F1.2. This is a manual focus lens. It is available in a number of different mounts. However, in this case, I am looking at it on a Canon RF mount, which makes it, of course, really interesting to me, mostly for the reason that there haven't been a whole lot of third-party lenses available for the RF mount. And so, in this case, Canon does have a 50mm F1.2 RF mount, which is an amazing lens, by the way, but it is massive and it is massively expensive at around $2,300 US. So what we've got here is a 50mm F1.2 that you can purchase for, about $330, so roughly $2,000 less. Now, that's obviously going to be intriguing for some people who don't mind manual focus, which, by the way, is on mirrorless bodies is a whole lot more convenient, I find. Though I will point out that the lack of electronics on this particular lens means that you don't get the assistance of Canon's really great focus guide, which I find a lot of fun to use for manual focus. But things like focus peaking and overlays, the ability to magnify the image, all of that stuff remains the case here. And so it does make it a whole lot easier to nail focus, even if you're shooting with a very wide aperture like f1.2. So is this a lens that you should consider? Well, let's try to find out together. We're going to jump in first of all and take a closer look at the build and the design here and see what you're actually getting for your money. Let's jump in and take a look. So the first thing that stands out to me is that this is a actually very nicely made lens. All metal construction. I've reviewed now a number of Meike lenses, and typically I'm not all that impressed. And I will say that typically one of the areas I'm least impressed is the quality of the focus ring. Sometimes it just feels like there's some slippage. It's not quite mechanically damped properly. In this case, we've got a nice, smooth, very highly functional focus ring, so kudos to them. Knurled metal, which has a great, to me, a great vintage feel to it. There are distance markings here, and as you can see, the focus throw is not huge. In fact, it's probably no more than about 100 degrees, and so you might have some issues with that. Your mileage may vary. You also have a declicked manual aperture ring a little bit further on, and so this also moves very nice and smooth. The feeling is not light, which is good, because if it's declicked, you don't have detents to hold everything, and so having a nice amount of damping on there means that you can set what you want and not worry about it moving accidentally. Looking towards the back of this, realize that this is a lens that is designed for multiple camera systems, and there is some depth in here, and that is to get the rear elements and the optical path, the proper distance away from the flange in a mirrorless body like the Canon RF mount that this is made for. Up front, we have a 67mm front filter thread, which of course is nice and common. As you can see, there is some internal play in and out as you focus, and so at infinity is when you are fully retracted. At minimum focus, you are the most far forward. Now, a note on minimum focus, the closest you can focus with this lens is around 60 centimeters or 0.6 meters, about 2 feet. You can't really get all that close, and your maximum magnification level is not particularly high. It comes with your caps. It does come with a little lens pouch. It also comes with a rather cheap feeling hood relative to the nice build of the lens itself. Everything here is metal. This feels like cheap plastic. It does have a few different textures on it and some ribbing on the inside. And so anyway, it mounts on there. It does its job, but it's probably the least special part of the build. So in terms of those raw specifications, this lens weighs in at 620 grams, and so it is fairly heavy due to that metal construction. As you can see, now this is not for Canon RF, this is for Sony FE, but this is a 50mm f1.4 lens, and so you can see that it has a similar length, but it is much wider in girth, and so the Meike is relatively slim. Inside we have 10 aperture blades, and as you can see, it does quite a good job of keeping a circular aperture shape. We can also see that the blades are nice and even, unlike some Viltrox lenses where the blades become uneven. It's actually got a really nice looking aperture iris. And also inside we have got 12 elements in 7 groups making up the optical formula. So I would say good marks here in terms of the build quality and the functionality in hand when focusing the lens. So overall, really good impressions here. I was a little bit nervous when I said yes to reviewing the lens because, frankly, there's been several Meike lenses before that I've been, let's just say, less than impressed with. And one of those was their 50mm F1.7. In this case, however, the build is actually really quite nice and, high-grade materials, good performance on the rings and the aperture ring. So I'm pleased with all of that. I would, of course, love to have electronics and all the additional things that brings you, getting your XF information to the camera, having direct input for example, if you're shooting with one of the newer EOS R5 or R6 bodies, automatic input for setting up your in-body image stabilization. The upside, of course, is that I can attest that you can set it to 50mm and you can get effective image stabilization with the lens on those bodies. But, of course, having all of that information is helpful. It would be helpful in finding a correction profile and all of those things. But that's not here, and of course, you're not paying a whole lot of money. What you're really paying for is to get a lens that can go all the way to f1.2. So in this case, is it worth doing? Is this a lens at f1.2 or wide apertures that is worth investing in? The answer is a little bit complicated, and it will really come down to what your shooting priorities are. So let's jump in and let's take a look. So first of all, we'll take a look at our vignette and distortion. You can see that there definitely is some barrel distortion at 50mm, fairly obvious. Also some vignette that really is kind of concentrated in the corners rather than, kind of a more linear all around the edge of the frame. I've brought about a manual correction by adding on a +11 and to deal with the distortion, and you can see it's not perfectly corrected, it's not perfectly linear, but has corrected reasonably well, and then a +50 and sliding the midpoint all the way over to the left. Now in this case, it is a little bit tough to perfectly correct the vignette because it is so concentrated in the corners. You could amp that up. You end up with a little too much brightness, maybe mid-frame, because it's less linear. So, I mean, you may want to play with that to see what, you personally prefer. Your mileage may vary somewhat on that, but I mean, it is possible to go all the way to the edge, I think with a slight bit maybe of overcorrection, however. Now you can see if you stop down from f1.2 to around f2 that you get considerably less overall vignette, and so as you progress through the zoom range, that vignette will definitely start to clear up of its own accord. So we're doing this test on a 45 megapixel EOS R5, and so obviously pretty demanding. So what I've got on the left side, I have got f1.2, on the right side I've got f1.4. Now as is fairly common, not at all unusual for lenses like this, as the vignette lifts a little bit, your actual, as it evaluates meters for the whole, frame, kind of a center weighted, you see that you end up with a similar shutter speed, and we can see looking here, we definitely have not a huge amount of sharpness and contrast in particular. I mean, there is usable resolution there, but not a lot of acuity of those fine textures, and you can see that the text here, there's a lot of bleed. It's just not particularly clean, but we can also see that there's not really a significant difference between f1.2 and f1.4, just maybe a little bit more contrast. Now the mid-frame actually looks a little bit more competent to my eye. Again though, there's basically no difference between f1.2 and f1.4. If we look down into the corners, actually I'm a little bit surprised here in that actually I think that this resolution is not terrible. Contrast is really low, as you can see, but you can actually see that there is a pretty good resolving of details there. It hasn't lost a lot. What you can also see, however, and we can see it even more if we jump to the other side, is that there is a fair bit of lateral chromatic aberration here towards the edges, and you can see that contrast is really dropping as we move towards the corners. And since none of us really look at images at 200%, let's go back to 100% here for real-world evaluation. And you can see that image here overall looks good. And of course the bokeh, as we'll get to in a moment, is very nice and soft. Here's another real-world example towards f2. You can see depth of field remains very shallow. However, that increased contrast, particularly in the center 2/3 of the frame, allows you to have actually a pretty nice amount of punch to the image here in this setting, while again continuing to have fairly nice bokeh quality. Now f1.8 to f2, you see just a little bit more contrast. And if we go on down to f2.8, we can see that contrast and thus detail is continuing to improve. Looking towards the mid-frame is now looking pretty good, and looking towards the center is now looking quite punchy with really good contrast and more acuity, although this lens at no point is the sharpest lens that I've seen for sure, but now we're getting into a very useful amount of sharpness. Stopping on down to f4 gives us a little bit more punch in the center of the frame. We can see our mid-frame is continuing to look good, though not exceptional, and down in the corner, ironically, things actually don't seem to sharpen up in the corners to the same degree. It's like we hit a limit, and the sharpness profile continues to favor the center 2/3 of the frame, and we actually almost start to lose a little bit of corner punch. At f5.6, you see a similar truth here to where corners really don't look fantastic. Meanwhile, the mid-frame is looking very sharp, and the center is looking really punchy at this point. Now once again, out in the real world again, f5.6, center of the frame you can see looks impressive, and this shows you that that 45 megapixels is capable of producing really, really detailed images. But we can see as we move off towards the edge of the frame, we can really see a dump of contrast in the textures and detail, and that we're losing that great sharpness that we have in the center 2/3 of the frame. Now at f8, we see a little bit more sharpness. You can see that lateral chromatic aberration continues to be an issue, so that does rob us of a little contrast. However, center and mid-frame look really fantastic. If I look on down here, that looks great. At this bill also, everything looks really good. But note this, the upper edge of this compared to the lower edge, you can see just how much, even in the width of that bill, how much we are losing from one edge to the other. You can definitely see chromatic aberrations, and when you get down to the corner, much softer. Now here is a real-world landscape at f8, and so you can see again, center of the frame looks fantastic. Moving off to the edge of the frame, though, that resolution drops off in the outer, basically, third of the frame. So here we can see that that lateral chromatic aberration is definitely evident. We can also see that longitudinal chromatic aberration is here as well. So some purple before the plane of focus, some green afterward. And so like many f1.2 lenses, particularly older school f1.2 lenses, there is some trade-offs. And so on the negative side, there's definitely some lateral chromatic aberrations. This was definitely true of lenses like Canon's 85mm F1.2L, the EF version, not the RF version. Stopping down to f1.8 range, we can definitely see f2 range. We can see that you definitely start to lose some of those longitudinal chromatic aberrations, and so as a byproduct, we can see that contrast starts to really kick up. So we can see that our magnification figure is not particularly high here, somewhere around 0.10 times, which is low even for a 50mm lens. So that's nothing to write home at. Center of the frame, that's not too bad at f1.2. It's a tiny, depth of field there, and you could see some bleed off. But what we see is actually you stop down a bit to f2 range, and all of a sudden it looks really fantastic. And so, I would recommend doing that if you're shooting up close. You still get nice bokeh, and the upside is you get a lot of punch there on your subject. So speaking of bokeh, let's take a quick look at our geometry here. So off towards the edge of the frame, you can see that there is some distortion here, kind of the lemon shape as you stop down. We can see that you start to get more circular shape across the frame here. So as you stop down, you get more even circular shapes. However, you do start to see just a little bit the 9 aperture blades stop down a little bit further, and again, your geometry is more even. However, the blades are a little bit more evident as well. Here's another example with brighter kind of Christmas tree lights, and so we can see that, you know, this is wide open, so there's a little bit of softness there, but you can see also the image is fairly dynamic, and the only downside here is we definitely have some pretty strong concentric rings if you have really bright lights in the frame, and so, you know, what is commonly called onion bokeh. You definitely see some of that with these type of lights. Also, you can see some fairly pronounced fringing in this particular situation. But here is the strength of a lens like this. You know, your contrast is not amazingly high, but the trade-off is you often have really beautiful backgrounds, not with those bright like Christmas tree kind of highlights. That's a different kind of bokeh. But here I'm just talking about a just beautiful kind of fadeaway to cream kind of background. And so if your photography style is a little bit more, you know, maybe artistic, dreamy is another euphemism that's sometimes used. If you like the look of images like this, where it's not super high contrast, but it's just, you know, pointing attention to one subject and then blowing out the background, then this may just be a lens that you'll get a lot of joy out of. It does produce images that really do have that kind of dreamy quality, reminding me a bit of a lens like the older Zeiss planar 50mm F1.4, not the Sony Zeiss, but the Zeiss 50mm planar. You know, in this case too, I mean, you can see how just creamy the background quickly becomes, and you know, it's not technically perfect, but it really is aesthetically pleasing when viewing it at a global level. So for portrait type images, you just see they're unique. And so here, you know, holding the cat. And so, you know, the detail is only okay with a high resolution body, but the overall look of the image is really intriguing, particularly if you like to really stylize your images and add, you know, filters to them. I think you can really do some creative things. So looking at this particular image, it looks fine viewed at a global level, cool bokeh. You know, jumping in, you can see that my focus was a little bit before her eye. And so, you know, again, it's about the global look of the image rather than the technical details. Now, in this case, we can see that focus is proper, and you can see that there's a reasonable amount of contrast, but this is not like every pore that is showing. Instead, however, skin tones do look nice, and the overall look of the image, of course, is really nice. So another area that is unsurprisingly not particularly strong with an f1.2 lens is flare resistance. Those large glass elements that's just a typical vulnerability. And so I'm just going to show you, this is stop down. You can see the flare pattern. The ghosting pattern becomes a little bit more pronounced. Here a little bit wider open. You can see, depending on where you place things, you know, you do have a ghosting artifact here. This is wide open. You do get this kind of broad ring look, which, you know, does have some artistic value. And then, you know, here on the subject, again, contrast is not amazing on the subject. However, the global look of the image, it has character. You may or may not like that character, but I want to give you a look at that. So as you can see, as far as technical perfection, while the lens does sharpen up really nicely in the middle 2/3 of the frame, you're never going to get sharp corners. And so don't buy this to be a, you know, some kind of landscape type image. You'll get much better results with many other lenses for landscape purposes that can go sharply into the corners. But I would say the best bet for a person is, you know, as a prospective buyer, is someone that really loves to shoot portraits and who really loves to shoot portraits that are more about creating a mood. And you want a lens that has unique rendering, has great style to it. And in that case, I think that this lens really has the capability of producing some really amazing type images, as long as your shooting style is less about, you know, technical perfection. You don't mind a little less contrast, for example, on your subject's face. You don't need, you know, every eyelash to be sharply delineated, but you're more about the mood of images. This is a lens that I think that some people will really appreciate. And as I noted, it does remind me a lot of the original Zeiss planar 50mm F1.4, in that it has somewhat of a dreamy character at wide apertures, beautiful soft bokeh. And, you know, and the Zeiss lens, however, does sharpen up a little bit more when you stop it down. But at the same time, there's a lot there that I'm reminded of here. So if you are an artistic, dreamy style portrait photographer, I think you could have a lot of fun with this lens and not spend a lot of money, which if you've just made a big investment in a new Canon mirrorless body, or if you're buying it for one of those other mounts, you know, it may be a breath of fresh air to get a lens that you'll have fun with, but won't break the bank to procure it. And so if that fits you, then this is a lens worth considering. If you're more about technical perfection and you want a super sharp lens, you need to look elsewhere. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, I do have linkage to a mini review / image gallery where you can check out lots more photos and look at them a little bit longer. There's also a linkage in the description down below if you want to purchase one of these for yourself. Also linkage to follow me on social media, to become a patron, to sign up for my newsletter, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.